Hello, I'm Dr. Ekaterini Klepusniotou and I'm a lecturer at the Institute of Psychological Sciences at the University of Leeds. Today I will be talking to you about electroencephalography, or EEG for a shorter version of that name, EEG standing for electroencephalography. So what is electroencephalography? Electroencephalography is the measurement of electrical activity produced by the brain as recorded from electrodes placed on the scalp. In fact, the neurons we have in our brain, the nerve cells that actually make up our brain, they communicate with each other through electricity, and it is that electricity, that electrical signals, those electrical pulses that we are actually recording with electroencephalography. So basically we use head electrodes that are mounted on a cap to record the electrical activity from our brain, and that can give us information about processing in the brain. And I will explain to you how that happens, how we record and how we interpret those recordings. Now, EEG was invented in 1928 by Hans Berger, so quite some time ago. And Hans Berger was actually the first scientist to record electrical activity from the brain, from a living human being. Now, the method is non-invasive. You may feel, oh God, electrical activity, putting electrodes on the scalp. But actually, we're just recording the electrical activity of the brain. We are not inducing any electrical activity. So it's our brain actually creating this electricity, and we are just measuring it, recording it. Now, like electrical activity, the EEG has several frequency bands, and we can actually describe the different waves. They have names and specific frequencies they occur in, and usually they are associated with a specific function. So, for example, we have alpha waves that occur in frequencies from 8 to 13 Hertz. They occur usually more occipitally. Then we have beta waves that occur in frequencies between 13 and 30 Hertz, and they're more parietal and frontal. We have theta waves that occur in frequencies between 4 to 8, and we usually observe those in children or sleeping adults. And we also have delta waves that occur from frequencies 0.5 to 4 Hertz. And again, those are observed in infants or sleeping adults. So these various frequency bands together, they make the EEG signal. And EEG can be used to monitor alertness. So we have a very different signal. We see a very different picture of how this electricity signal that we record from the brain looks like when people are awake, when they are asleep, when they are in REM sleep, or rapid eye movement sleep. This is the part of our sleep where we see our dreams, basically. Or when people are in deep sleep, and of course when there is cerebral death or no response from the brain. Now, this is the raw signal, the electricity that we record from the brain. How can we use that to study cognition is the next question. And we can do that by focusing on what is called ERPs, or event-related potentials. ERPs are formed by averaging EEG time-locked to the onset of a stimulus that requires cognitive processing. So ERPs represent electrical activity generated in the brain that is associated with the processing of cognitive stimuli. ERPs can be related to different types of cognitive tasks. So, for example, they can be related to attention or memory or language comprehension. So what do ERPs reflect? They reflect sensory, motor, or cognitive tasks that take place in the brain. And they are the synchronous activity of a large population of neurons engaged in information processing. There are several components in this signal that we capture, in these ERPs that we capture from the brain. We can focus on different parts of this signal, either earlier or later parts of this processing signal, and we can talk about the different components. So what are the characteristics of ERP components? Well, we use three ways in describing and characterizing these components. The first one is polarity. In other words, is it a positive wave or a negative wave? The second characteristic we use to describe ERP components is latency. How long after stimulus presentation does it peak? That is, does it grow? And the third way we describe an ERP component is its functional significance. In other words, what cognitive or perceptual activity is it sensitive to? That is, what makes it bigger or smaller? We have very early components in the signal that occur, let's say, less than 50 milliseconds after the onset of a stimulus. And these very early components, they represent evoked activity in auditory pathways in the brainstem. They are purely driven by sensory factors, and they respond to the features of the stimulus, the external features of a stimulus. Later components, however, those starting appearing from about 100 milliseconds after the onset of a stimulus, they relate more to cognitive processes. I will be describing ERP components to give you an example that relate to language comprehension. So I will be talking about the P300, the M400 and the P600 in a little while. And basically these components are sensitive to changes in people. They're sensitive to changes in the meaning of the stimulus, not just the physical characteristics. And they're also sensitive to information processing demands. So, taking language as an example and discussing the ERP components, the first one I mentioned was the P300. P because it is a positively going wave that peaks about 300 milliseconds after the onset of the stimulus. And that's how it gets its name, the P300 component. This component is sensitive to probability or the importance of a stimulus. It is typically seen when we use the oddball paradigm. So, for example, we may have a sequence of sounds where you hear the sound ba, ba, ba repetitively, and then you have a slight change to it. So you may hear ba, 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 pa, ba. And when you hear pa, which is different from the rest of the sounds, then you have an increase on the P300 component. That is the oddball paradigm. The P300 component reflects updating a model of the world in memory. It orients to novel or important stimuli and keeps track of how often these stimuli occur. So the P300 increases when stimuli are important to the subject. Another component related to language comprehension is the N400 component. N because it is a negatively going wave that peaks around 400 milliseconds after the onset of the stimulus. Now this component has a very different function. It is actually sensitive to the difficulty of understanding the meaning of a word. So it measures processing difficulty. It is observed to anomalies in the middle of a sentence as well as at the end of a sentence. The M400 decreases if a word is repeated, and it is smaller for frequent words than for rare words. In sensible sentences, the M400 is big for initial words, and then it decreases for later ones. So when we have a sentence, the M400 is actually bigger if the stimulus is semantically incongruous. Kutas and Hilliard in 1980 were the first ones to observe and describe this component, and an example of the sentences they used would be, the pizza was too hot to eat, which is a perfectly sensible sentence, therefore the M400 component was very, very small. The pizza was too hot to drink, which is a bit surprising, so the M400 was a little bit bigger for the word drink, because we expect to eat pizzas, not drink them. And the M400 was really big when they presented the sentence, the pizza was too hot to cry, because pizzas don't cry. So this is a very surprising ending, and therefore the M400 component increases. Finally, the last component that is related to language comprehension is the P600 component. P because it is a positively going wave that peaks around 600 milliseconds after the onset of the stimulus, therefore the P600 component. This component is sensitive to the grammaticality of the words in a sentence. It seems that the brain areas involved with dealing with the grammaticality of a sentence are quite comparable to those that deal with probability. And there is indication that the P600 component is related to the P300 component that we just saw a while ago. So unusual grammatical events are dealt with like other sorts of surprising events. So the P600 increases when the stimuli are ungrammatical. And again, from Kutas and Hilliard's study in 1980, when we have a sentence like, the cats won't eat, that's a perfectly grammatical sentence, the P600 is very small. But if we have a sentence, the cats won't eating, this is grammatically incorrect, and therefore we have an increased P600 component. So let's quickly summarize what we've seen. We've talked about electroencephalography, which is a method to record the electrical activity of the brain. And we talked about the ERPs, the event-related potentials, that is electrical brain activity associated with processing particular types of stimuli. The ERPs reflect postsynaptic potentials between the neurons in the brain, and they are sensitive to different kinds of cognitive processes. As examples of different components of ERPs, we've used language comprehension, and we've described three components. The P300 component, that is elicited by surprising events, and it's related to updating a model of the world in memory. The M400 component, that is elicited by meaningful stimuli and measures processing difficulty. And the P600 component, that is elicited by ungrammatical stimuli and seems to be related to the P300 component. Now, ERPs are great in helping us understand how the brain processes all these stimuli. They have an excellent, very high temporal resolution, so they can tell us millisecond by millisecond how a cognitive process unfolds in time. They're not excellent at describing exactly where in the brain that process takes place, mainly because the skull intervenes and deflates a little bit this signal. So we don't know exactly which part of the brain is sending us this signal. However, they're sensitive to what sorts of cognitive processes are active, and they're excellent for studying cognitive processes that unfold rapidly in time. Thank you so much for listening to me, and have a good day.